You see, I'm a guy of simple taste. I enjoy, dynamite, and gunpowder, and gasoline. What's it? All you care about is money. This town deserves a better class of criminal. And I'm gonna give it to him.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, let's start a new class of criminal with these custom villain-themed Hearthstone cards. Up first here we have the Night King from Game of Thrones. This card comes from Poodlefez. It's a 5-mana 3/5 Warlock legendary minion, and it reads, whenever an enemy minion dies, summon a 2/2 copy of it. So this takes cards like maybe Necrotic Geist we saw in the past, and it kind of flips it. It's not your minions dying, it's your enemy minions dying, which clearly has some neat interactions. You know, if you can clear your opponent's board with Hellfire, you might summon a bunch of 2/2 copies of all those little minions, and that could be a really big sort of swing with Night King. Alternatively, if you don't have anything to do with Night King, he's kind of just sitting there dead, but he has a reasonable health total, so he's okay. But then keep in mind, if your opponent trades their stuff into him, because you got to deal with him, right? You got to respect him. Everything he kills before dying, he's going to summon a 2/2 copy of it. So there are shenanigans there, hiding him behind taunts, or just playing him into a board of small stuff. All of that means he creates some neat little opportunities and quite a bit of friction for your opponent. Now, you know, this is a reactionary card. It's conditional. It's not always going to be good. I don't think it ever allows you to, like, really swing the game in crazy ways because, you know, I mentioned, like, Hellfire. That's a cool idea, but if your opponent's just got a bunch of small stuff that's not high value, you're going to summon a bunch of small stuff that's not high value. That's a 9-mana combination. You know, those sorts of things happen later in the game. So I do think there are some elements that help keep a card like this in check so it doesn't totally snowball all over the place, but it's still something that captures the flavor of the character beautifully, and I think it's a good fit for Warlock as well, so a pretty nifty little card. So up next here, let's talk about Annie Leonhardt from A Mage Old as Dirt. I'm not a weeb, but I do think this is a character from the anime Attack on Titan. And she's a 3-mana 3/1 warrior legendary minion. She starts out with Taunt, so pretty bad by default, but she has this effect that reads, after this minion survives damage, transform it into the female Titan. Now, notably, she only has 1 health, so she's not going to be surviving damage ever at her base state. You essentially have to combo this card, give it a health buff of some kind, and then deal damage to it so that you can summon the female Titan. And the female Titan is obviously crazy amazing. It's a 6-mana 6/6 with charge. It's a big body. It can go face. It has a death rattle that summons another Annie Leonhardt. So as soon as you deal with the female Titan, you've got Annie Leonhardt again, which could cause some problems. Now, the question is, how do you activate this one? And that's the question that I think makes this card really interesting is, like, to get this reward, you have to support this somehow in Warrior, which really isn't that easy to do in Warrior. There aren't that many health buff style cards available outside of some of the neutral set stuff. So you support it, you get this reward, and then you get a female Titan. Once she dies, how do you get your Annie Leonhardt buffed again and create this chain? It's not going to be easy to chain this. Like, you might get one consistently or easily if you have your decks built to support it, and then your opponent kind of deals with the Annie Leonhardt, and it never transforms into the female Titan again. So I like this idea of, like, creating this chain of events, and again, I think this captures the flavor of the character pretty nicely from my understanding of, you know, wikiing it real quickly. Sounds like it does. So I like this idea of, like, this card with a lot of opportunity, a lot of upside, but it takes some work. It takes some deck building to support it. I'm not sure it'd be very good. I think, frankly, based on what we see in Warrior right now, it might actually be pretty bad. It would be really hard to do this. You'd have to sacrifice your deck a little bit too much. But nonetheless, like, that's okay. It's okay for cards that don't work right now, that have a cool idea, and maybe some support pieces come along later for a card like this. But the idea that, you know, whirlwinding it eventually, that is a Warrior sort of thing. So it still feels like it fits the class, just not exactly perfectly right now, but that's good. That creates opportunity. That creates designs that do cool new things. So all in all, I think this would be a cool card to see in the game. Up next here, let's talk about Onslaught, a villain from Marvel Comics that I vaguely remember reading about when I was a kid. It's from Andy Beast, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a Warlock legendary this time around, 9 mana, 7/8, and it reads, whenever your opponent plays a minion, add its attack and health onto this minion. Now, we do have a little bit of a typo here with the wrong its, but I'm going to forgive it in this case because I think this card's actually pretty cool. The idea here is, you know, Onslaught's basically pulling in people into himself, which again reflects the flavor of the character rather nicely. I like when cards capture that aspect of characters. And the question then becomes like, well, how does this card look, right? If you just plop this 9 mana 7/8, your opponent plays a 4/4, and it's like, boom, you have an 11/12, right? They play a 5/5. It's like, boom, you have a 16/17 at that point. And it's like, my God, this minion could get really, really big really fast. Now, of course, with a minion like this, it's obviously susceptible to single target removal, as any big minion is. But that's okay, you know? I don't think every minion has to be obviously good or really, really impactful in a game necessarily, particularly not with Blizzard. They design minions that are more fun and just crazy, and I think that's a cool idea for a card like this. Plus, with like summoning effects and way to cheat things out of your deck, like Darkest Hour, for instance, it's like, well, maybe you could summon this with 3 other things at the same time. Then it's like, well, which of these 3 giant threats do I respect? And like, while you're removing something else more threatening, it's like Onslaught's getting buffed the whole time. Summoning this as a 1/1 from Dollmaster Dorian, right? It doesn't matter that it's a 1/1 because it's going to get some buffs. It's going to get improved. So cards like this just create all these cool moments and opportunities to do really neat things, even though it doesn't look good at a base level. It's like, I bet a card like this could find play in some crazy deck out there with some weird synergy pieces. So to me, I think this is a really fun design. Despite the typo, just a great card otherwise. So now let's talk about Knucklebone Loss. Last spark, we have some Magic the Gathering apparently leaking into our Hearthstone cards. I don't know about this. It comes from Dr. Kiwi this time around. 4 mana, 4/4 dragon. Battle cry, if your opponent's hero power isn't their starting one, shuffle it into their deck. So we have hero power tech here, which I think is really, really cool. We've seen other hero power tech cards that were temporary, right? Where they just kind of disable your opponent's hero power for a little while, make it cost more, whatever it is. But this one's a little bit more universal, and it particularly answers things like Gin and Baku. And although Gin and Baku aren't currently in Hearthstone standard format, they certainly are still in Wild, and I have to imagine there will be other hero power manipulation cards, including the hero cards that are currently out, like Dr. Boom and Hagatha and Zul'jin to some extent. You might still want to remove those hero powers, right, because they're so impactful. And Knucklebone Loss would be exactly the sort of card that allows you to do that. Now, how does this work, right? Dr. Kiwi did include some extra stuff to help explain this, but it's, to me, pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it really needs any extra explanation. You literally remove their hero power and you shuffle it as a card into their deck, and then they draw that card. It's 2 mana, and they have to spend that 2 mana to regain their hero power, and then the hero power still costs 2 mana. So there's like this 4 mana impact to find it again. But theoretically, you know, they may not find it for a while. It might take them 4, 5, 6 turns, and that can make all the difference. And as a 4 mana 4/4, you're not sacrificing much here with Knucklebone Loss to actually play it, so you're happy in a hero power driven meta for a tech card like this to exist, and I think this is a really elegant way to do that. Now, I'll be honest, I have no idea how this connects to Knucklebone Loss, the character in Magic the Gathering, but I don't care. It's just a cool impact. Maybe the idea is that Magic the Gathering doesn't have hero powers, as it were, so Knucklebone Loss, a Magic character, is shuffling them away to make it a little bit more like Magic. That works for me. That's connection enough. But regardless, I just like the design of this card. I think it'd be a really interesting way to address potential hero power problems in the game. Moving on, let's take a look at Moira from DeGolfer222. This is a character from Overwatch who melds healing and damage together in an interesting way, and that's exactly what this card does too. It's a 4 mana 3/5 legendary for Priest, and it reads, whenever this minion deals damage, heal adjacent minions by that amount. So much like in Overwatch, when Moira deals damage, she can essentially heal her allies. And that's a really cool idea for Priest, right? Investing in a minion a little bit, and then when it does damage, instead of like healing your face, healing the minions next to it is cool for things like Northshire Cleric, or just healing up really big taunts, or injured Blade Masters, or damaged Stegatrons. Whatever it might be, a card like this gives you that option. Now, would this card be amazing? Not necessarily. I don't know right now. It doesn't feel like this card would be worth it as we understand Priest today, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be awesome. And with buffs out there that can make this even bigger, suddenly converting your damage into healing, I think, is a really cool idea. And there are ways to synergize with that. So, although, no, I don't see a path for this card right now, I think it's a great representation of the character. It's an idea that Priest could theoretically get behind at some point with those damage style minions or just healing up big taunts, whatever it is. Now, I do think giving this card something like Rush would probably help a lot because you could do it in a more controlled fashion. Right now, you're kind of plopping down your Moira and hoping that it works on a future turn. That might be hard, but still, if you can imagine like a turn 4 Moira into like an injured Blade Master Northshire Cleric on turn 5, that would be a really good turn, right? And you'd draw a card and you'd heal your injured Blade Master and you'd have a pretty good board. And as a 3/5, I think she has a lot of potential to exist. Believe she could have been a 4/5 or a 3/6 but this stat line works just fine and creates some interesting moments for Priest. So to me, I think this card's a great representation of the character and a fun little idea for Priest. So now let's talk about Lord Voldemort from Deloa. This is another Warlock legendary, 8 mana, 4/1 this time around. Of course, Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Most people will probably be familiar with that. The battle cry here reads, add 7 Horcruxes to your hand. This minion is immune while you have the 7 in hand. And a Horcrux is a 0 mana spell. It reads, Lord Voldemort is immune while you have 7 Horcruxes in hand. Now, from my memory, I didn't think there were 7 Horcruxes, to be honest. I'm not a Harry Potter nerd. I thought there were fewer than that, but that's not super relevant here because I think it's important that you have 7 of these cards in your hand. Because the way this works is, right, this minion's unkillable. It's a 4/1. It just won't take damage. It won't die as long as you have all 7 of these things in hand. And that's basically your punishment for having an immune minion, right? You have to hold on to a hand that's mostly full of dead stuff, like cards that you just can't play because you want to keep your Lord Voldemort alive. But interestingly, with cards like Plot Twist, suddenly I think that's a really interesting turn. Most of you will know I don't like Plot Twist much. I don't think it's a very good card as it stands right now because it gives you a little bit of a card advantage sacrifice. You're kind of trading off a Plot Twist just to get some choices and you're losing a card in hand. But with something like this where you could generate a bunch of extra cards and then Plot Twist, suddenly that's like you're drawing those cards because you're just trading a bunch of empty Horcruxes for a lot of new cards. That could be a fun idea. Beyond that, just having a 4/1 immune minion on board can create some shenanigans, buffing it up. It can be bigger and bigger and bigger. So there are neat opportunities there. Now, before you all freak out, the game is already coded. If a minion is immune with taunt, you can bypass it. You can't lock out the game with a taunted immune minion. That's already in Hearthstone today. That's already a thing. So giving it taunt is not a big deal. It does not matter. That does not impact how the game plays at all. It'll just get ignored, much like if it has stealth. So don't freak out there. It's more about making trades or creating a threat that your opponent literally just can't resolve very well with damage on board. But another interesting idea with these Horcruxes is these are 0 mana spells, and things like Gadgets and Auctioneer could work really well with 0 mana spells. So a couple different directions to do this, which seems like it has a lot of upside. But remember, you're playing an 8 mana 4/1 otherwise, which is just not a good play. It's incredibly slow, very rife to, aggro just running you over. So some real potential risks when playing something like this, but also some neat little upsides. So depending on the deck, depending on the meta, I think a card like this would allow you to do some pretty crazy cool things, but it's just not going to be good a lot of the time as well, which is, in my mind, good design. A lot of risk-reward, balancing act here. So Deloa, thanks for creating this cool version of Lord Voldemort, even if it doesn't maybe capture the character perfectly as far as I remember, but maybe I'm wrong. Up next here we have Sauron from Lord of the Rings. This card comes from Nilaku. It's a 5 mana 8/8 neutral legendary with taunt. And the battle cry reads, shuffle the One Ring into your opponent's deck. The One Ring is a 1 mana spell that reads, give your hero stealth until your next turn. If you burn this card, you win the game. So great reference there to Lord of the Rings, burning the ring, destroying Sauron, winning you the game. In this case, that's really cool. Now, burning the card is not something a lot of decks are going to be able to do often, but, occasionally that could happen. Control decks or things, like a priest could go double Northshire and draw a bunch of cards and burn it. So there are some possibilities here to give the opponent an instant win condition. So there is a fair bit of risk bundled into Sauron, which is important because it's a 5 mana 8/8. And we have seen this 5 mana 8/8 stat line in the past. Cards like Fell Reaver, Bittertide Hydra, they all had these downsides. I will admit, I think their downsides are a little bit more direct. Although with Fell Reaver, in most cases, it wasn't really much of a downside at all. So you might be thinking, oh my god, Regis, a 5-mana 8/8 with taunt is way too freaking good. The One Ring isn't really that big of a downside. And I do hear your argument, but I want you to keep in mind, we live in a world today where like mountain giants are everywhere. 8/8 Edwin Van Cleefs are regularly seen on turn 3 or 4. I don't know that a 5-mana 8/8 right now is all that scary, particularly because the One Ring is actually a really good card for your opponent to get. Getting stealth like that can go a long way towards buying them time, and then just occasionally you're going to lose a game if you run this card. So there are some risks bundled against Sauron's advantages, and I think it's great. It's a really strong card. Like, it could probably be a 7/7, or maybe just doesn't have taunt. But I don't think it's too great. I don't think it's beyond the realm of reason. Plus, again, this card is just so freaking flavorful, and it feels really fun that I think a little bit of those balance issues might be okay with me. I want to focus on the other great design aspects of this card. So I'm a little bit forgiving because everything else is just perfect as far as I'm concerned. So to me, I think this card gets there, and I like this design a lot. Now let's talk about Queen Azshara, and here we have a character from Warcraft, which is great, a villain that actually fits into Hearthstone. It's a perfect combination. This one comes from I'm Zekarella. It's a 4-mana 3/5 Shaman Legendary, and it reads, at the end of your turn, summon a Naga with stats equal to your overloaded mana crystals. And you might be looking at this card, and you might think, oh my god, Regis, that's just like exactly like Thunderhead. It's like the same stat line, the same body, and it's an overload that summons stuff. And okay, I think that's a fair first reaction. But I want to point out some of the differences that to me make this card really interesting, perhaps even more interesting than Thunderhead. The way Thunderhead works is, right, you play it and you want to overload a bunch of stuff right now to get all these little rush dudes, and you run them in, and you're happy that you summoned a really wide board of small guys and potentially use it as a swing card. I think Queen Azshara exists in an interesting separate space where she might be a card where you have this giant overload turn previously. Like maybe you play 6 or 7 overload of stuff in a turn, right? Or maybe just 4 or 5 even is enough, because it might be hard to get to 6 or 7 in a single turn, but it's possible. And you don't have a Thunderhead out there, so you're just doing all your big dump of overload. And then the following turn, when you only have 4 mana remaining, sometimes you're completely stuck with nothing cool or exciting to do, but suddenly Queen Azshara comes along, and you can drop her for 4 mana, and you're still going to have overloaded mana crystals, right? Which means from the previous turn, because they were overloaded this turn, which means she's going to summon you like a 6/6 or a 5/5 or even a 4/4, right? And what it means is like, whereas normally when you overload, you're kind of going all in on this turn and then having a bad second turn, Queen Azshara creates these moments where you can have a good second turn, where you can actually still leverage your overload on a second instance. It's not like beforehand or pre the overload. It's actually about maybe after the overload you can do some cool things. Now, notably, you could still play Queen Azshara with your overload too, right? Like Rain of Toads into Queen Azshara on the same turn is still going to be a pretty insane turn. So she still has that opportunity for a card like Thunderhead. She just goes beyond that and can do things the next turn, which to me is really cool, and even really kind of captures the idea of a Naga, like lurking under the sea, plotting, waiting, and then boom, something crazy's happening, right? And of course, also, she goes tall instead of wide, so that creates a pretty neat distinction against Thunderhead for different sorts of metas. So to me, I think this card actually, although it's similar in a lot of ways, distinguishes itself in others and actually looks like a really neat way for Overload Shaman to do something different, and that to me is why it's on this list. So now let's move on to Bellatrix Lestrange. Card from Mage here that again references Harry Potter. She's a 5-mana 6/2 rogue legendary. Her battlecry reads, transform all spells in your hand into Avada Kedavra. I don't know how that's said. I'm not a Harry Potter nerd, like I said. They keep their costs. So we have a card here a bit like Lillian Voss almost, transforming spells in your hand. But as you can see with the example here, Avada Kedavra is a removal spell. It just reads, destroy a minion. So it's a now 0 mana spell that destroys a minion because it was preparation. So with Bellatrix, you can take a bunch of low-cost cards in your hand and turn them into extremely efficient, cheap removal spells. Now, if you had, a Vanish, for instance, it would be a 6-mana removal spell, which might not be quite as exciting, right? And essentially 5 mana would be the break point on these being like good, right? Because of things like Assassinate being just a 5 mana single target removal card in Rogue. So anything less than 5, you're probably getting pretty excited. 4, 3, 2 mana is amazing for destroying a minion that efficiently. And I think a lot of reactions are going to be, oh my god, Regis, you can't give a deck a bunch of 0 mana destroy a minion cards, particularly Rogue, who already likes cheap spells. But my counter argument is that actually I think you probably can. There is some sacrifice in running a card like this. First off, she's a 6/2 for 5 mana. That's an incredibly weak stat line. So the turn you play this is somewhat risky. I mean, yes, you can probably flip it pretty hard if you have a couple preps in hand, right? But also that means if you're sitting on a couple preps and shadow steps and 0 and 1 mana spells, you've had a pretty bad hand and a really slow start to the game. So you're probably not looking in a good spot when you play Bellatrix Lestrange, particularly against aggro decks where single target removal doesn't go nearly as far. It's like, oh, I killed a bunch of 2/2s with like 4 of my spells and my hand is now empty. Now this does look a lot better against mid-range decks or minion-based late-game decks, right? Because you can suddenly kill a lot of their threats. But at the end of the day, remember, you are just emptying your hand. You are running out of resources, so you have to have some other things to support this. Beyond that, Bellatrix Lestrange is a legendary, so you can't necessarily rely on drawing her all that consistently. So there are a couple different things that keep a card like this in check, that keep it from going absolutely crazy. But there is still this neat opportunity for a deck to take a bunch of leftover garbage and potentially turn it into useful single target removal spells, which I think is pretty cool and a fun design that once again captures the character. And then finally here, let's take a look at Poison Ivy, a DC Comics villain from Poodle Fez. 3 mana, 2/2 druid minion. It's poisonous, and it also reads your hero is poisonous. So you have a card here that, Poison Ivy, she is literally all about poisoning people. And this card does the same. And in fact, a really cool Druid synergy card because Druid's hero power gives them this 1 damage ping that often doesn't go super far, but suddenly if your hero's poisonous, you can kill all kinds of big scary stuff using just your hero, because your hero now becomes poisonous. So you can attack that arch villain Rafam and kill a 7/8 for only 2 mana. And suddenly that's a really cool play. This reminds me a bit of almost like Vile Spine Slayer, for instance. Like, combo out 2 things, spend a total of 5 mana, and you can kill something while deploying a minion. Now, the minion in this case also poisonous, so really could create a lot of friction against big sorts of boards, but alternatively, a lot of instances where this card just doesn't do much, right? If you can keep her alive on board for a turn or two, suddenly she's very exciting because you get to hero power over and over again. But in other cases, she's just kind of a 1-turn swing opportunity, like a 1-turn removal card. So finding a deck to support her well is tough. Beyond that, your hero has to take damage when it takes these trades. Killing an archvillain or farm, you're still going to take 7 damage, which is a real downside. You can't just do that all day. You're eventually going to die. So even the upside on a card like this is checked a little, but still creates some nice swing opportunities and a lot of friction when you play her. A card like this would be absolutely busted in Arena, for instance. But in constructed standard format, I think she'd just feel okay and would probably be played in a handful of decks, which is a great design when it doesn't feel too crazy overpowered, but still has potential and still looks like a good card. And of course, as you guys know, I've said it a million times, perfect flavor capturing on this one. So all around, a really cool card. All right, folks, that wraps it up for this custom card review. As always, tons of fun cards. I had so many to choose from. These are the ones that stood out the most to me, but lots of great designs all around. Now, I know you're curious about next time. Well, guess what? It's going to be Game of Thrones themed. We had 1 Game of Thrones card in this video. Well, I want you to make more. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, obviously you're going to have tons of stuff to work with. If you're not a Game of Thrones fan, feel free to go on Wikipedia and read all about it. You can still find something cool. Now, I would encourage you guys, if you can, to find drawn painted artwork that matches the style of Hearthstone, but if you can't find it for your character, if you just want to use a screenshot from the show, that's fine. It's acceptable. I might choose an artwork-based card over yours if they're the exact same, but it's not going to reduce your odds of being in the video. You could still make the cut. So Game of Thrones themed card, no other restrictions, can be a spell, weapon, minion, whatever you want it to be. It just needs to be based on Game of Thrones. That said, the details are in the description below. You can check those out to go submit your cards and so on and so forth. But until then, thank you so very much for watching this time around. And until next time, game on.